we start with a deep dive into climate change. Now, our planet is literally hot and bothered right now about how human activity is damaging the atmosphere. And one phenomenon that's constantly reminding us of this is coastal flooding. Remember a few months ago when Mother Nature had her hot girl summer? Storm after storm caused coastal cities along the south and northeast to be pummeled with heavy rain and severe flooding. One of the most disastrous examples came from Hurricane Ida, which saw 95 deaths in the United States. It cut a path from Louisiana all the way up to Connecticut. Now, these horrific weather patterns are largely the result of how we produce energy. By burning coal, oil, and gas, humans are emitting greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane, which trap heat in the atmosphere. The Earth's temperature has increased 2 degrees Fahrenheit in less than a couple hundred years. At this rate, it'll rise as much as 5 degrees by the end of the century. Now, that may not sound like much, but this is a huge deal and a hot mess. In short, the hotter Earth gets, the more we're at risk for dangerous weather patterns and rising sea levels. To avoid more devastating water-related issues, climate advocates are stressing how important it is to take care of our resources. And they're pushing solutions like expanding tree coverage and ocean maintenance in coastal cities. To further this conversation, I want to bring in Jasmine Sanders, the Executive Director of Our Climate. Jasmine, welcome to Amplified. Thank you so much for joining us to talk about this. I would love for you to just start out by telling us a little bit about the work of Our Climate and what your group is doing to address coastal flooding.
Yes, thank you so much for having me tonight. Our Climate is a climate change advocacy organization. We're empowered by youth grassroots movement, working with high school and college students to advocate for science-based and equitable climate policy solutions. We're rooted in 3 principles. So environmental justice legislation, corporate polluter fees, and renewable energy targets. And it's through our leadership development program that we really invest in our young people to be able to advocate in a creative way, whether that's running a social media campaign, that's sitting down with their elected official, that's having the conversation at the dinner table with family and friends, and making sure that we are helping to mold them into multidimensional, lifelong climate advocates.
I really love the generational focus that you have on climate issues, because I've been talking about this, thinking about this from a policy perspective for at least 15 years. And so many, I'll say it, kind of nerdy, and we would call them our crunchy tree hugging friends, cared about this issue from the beginning. And a lot of people were tuned out. But the truth is that when we really think about our climate, we may not be the ones who are left to deal with the devastation. It's going to be our children. It's going to be their children. And so I'm excited that you're really focused on getting young people animated about doing something, because the older generations, may not be around to do something. I'm also interested if you could talk to us about, coastal flooding specifically and just water-related issues. We all think about, oh my God, Hurricane Katrina, it was bad for Black people. But generally speaking, can you talk about how flooding really affects communities of color differently?
Yeah, great question. Coastal flooding is only increasing. Climate change is an issue that exacerbates existing stressors and societal inequities. These are things that we saw when Hurricane Katrina happened. It is things we have seen, Hurricane Ida. The thing about coastal flooding is that it is part of those unsurvivable storm surges. So no matter if you are on the coast or you are inland, you are going to be affected. And when we talk about different communities being disproportionately impacted, we have to understand that, such as places in New Orleans where it's a majority Black population, you are living below sea level. And so that infrastructure is just not there. There have not been investments to address bridges and roadways and evacuation routes. This is where we talk about coastal flooding and the things that we could start to do, both on the local level, the national level, and regional levels.
I want to talk about the geography of the thing. Let's talk a bit about redlining. And I know people are watching this and they're like, Aisha, you're always talking about housing discrimination and redlining, and it's been a theme on this show. But for those who don't know, redlining was a form of color coding neighborhoods based on how many black people actually live there. And if an area was red, it was considered too dangerous compared to the pretty blue and green areas where white people lived. Now, this practice was put into place without any thought about how it would actually impact the entire country. And I would love for you to talk to us about how now we're seeing that housing discrimination and redlining has also influenced environmental racism. Break that down for us.
Yeah, let's break that down. So many people who are watching this right now know what redlining is. It directly impacted Black people in this country, not being able to live in certain areas due to the color of their skin, really ostracizing them to certain areas that were next to landfills, chemical plants, but also at-risk climate areas. This is not something we knew 40 years ago, but we know it now. And the thing that's happening with redlining currently is that you are having generations, you are having grandparents who are wanting to pass down generational wealth to their grandchildren. And they're having to second guess themselves. Well, should I pass down this asset as a house to my grandchildren, even though it's at risk? You are having banks that are now blue lining communities and people because they are living in at-risk areas. So now not only are you having the combination of redlining and blue lining, but you're having climate gentrification go on, such as in Miami area, where there's Little Haiti, and you're having different groups of demographics of people now come in and build these billion-dollar, million-dollar condos that are sitting up high on land. And pushing out people who have lived there for decades, and they can no longer afford it. There's no community investment into making sure that we are building affordable and sustainable housing and building up bridges and levees that will protect people who have been living in that community. Instead, it's more so the mindset of who matters? Why should we care about them? And this is an issue. We have seen this time and time again. So it is very important to continue to talk about this and to address it.
And so when we talk about redlining, we know that that was a government-sanctioned thing. It was like an actual policy, right, that they drew red lines around. Is blue lining something that is philosophical, or is it actually policy and or practice that is being put into place that we can then intercept?
Yeah, it's not a policy. However, it is a practice. Bankers are not extending mortgages to people who live in at-risk climate areas. And this is only something that is starting to be talked about and noticed. The connection directly between blue lining and redlining is that the same Black, brown, and other people of color who were targeted in redlining are being targeted in blue lining. These are also the same people who are the most disproportionately impacted when it comes to climate change. So yet again, this is another barrier for us to tackle. And if we're going to talk about this, then it's very vital for us to make sure that we are trying to achieve environmental justice, which is the fair treatment of all people and accessibility for all people, not just the people who can afford it, not just the people who have the resources. We need to spread the wealth.
I want to get into some of the politics of this, because when it comes to combating climate change, Black people care. Like, we really do care. We want to be involved. We want to fix things. And there's also data to support the notion that Black and Latinx people care more about climate change than white people in theory. But when you look at the organizations that are doing the environmental work, right, and the biggest voices on this, and granted, they're talking about, environmental whatevers. They're not necessarily talking about justice. But when you look at who is getting funded and doing the work, this still feels like a white-led movement. So can you talk to us a bit about the justice lens here, and how would you guide Black people to find the right connection points and resources to actually get involved and act?
The first thing to answer your question, I'm going to mention is voting. Voting is where our civic duty starts. It is not where it ends. We are supposed to make sure that we are constantly involved with our elected officials. This is how we make change happen. Every great social justice movement started on the local level. So attend those city council meetings, talk to your mayor, talk to your commissioner, then build it up to the statewide movement, to the national movement. Secondly, I would say that for Black people, we do not have time to wait. As you can see by the facts that have been laid out, the articles that are out there, we are disproportionately impacted. It is our duty, it is our responsibility to speak up for this. Nobody else is going to. History has told us that time and time again. We don't need to wait on history to keep proving that to us. And I would say that it is important for us to make sure that we have this justice lens, because climate change impacts each and every one of our lives and all aspects of it. It is not just an environmental and a financial impact that we are going to feel, but it is also a health issue, a migration issue, a sociocultural issue, a food insecurity issue, a racial issue. All of those are intersecting, and this is why climate change is such a complex intersectional issue. We need to care about this because it is our health at risk. How many more mamas out there have to keep buying asthma pumps on a monthly basis? And that costs hundreds and hundreds of dollars. And you're living next to a landfill. You're living next to a chemical plant. Here in DC, 1 out of 3 children suffer from asthma. If that's not enough for us to care about climate change and for us to make a difference, then I really don't know what is.
Yeah. Jasmine, I need to take a quick break, but please stay with me because we have a lot more to talk about. So hold tight there. My conversation with Jasmine Sanders is going to continue next here on Amplified. Welcome back, everybody. Before the break, we were talking about coastal flooding and climate change, particularly how communities of color are disproportionately dealing with the consequences of rising sea levels. Now, the question is, how do we create equitable infrastructure in order to remedy these flood patterns? Jasmine Sanders, the executive director of Our Climate, is back to help us answer that question. Jasmine, thank you so much for sticking around. Now, today, and you brought this up in the last segment about infrastructure. Today, President Biden outlined his multi-billion-dollar plan to upgrade the nation's aging ports and waterways. Now, this comes as the House finally approved his $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill, which includes $47 billion to help cities prepare for flooding, storms, droughts, and more. But some are saying it falls short of what the government really needs to tackle climate change. Do you agree? And how do you think that this money should actually be distributed to avert more problems?
Yeah. Well, first off, I think it is a good start. We have been behind in regards to addressing climate change around the world. And I think this is a good beginning investment. I think one of the first things that people are wanting to know is how this is going to be dispersed. What can they do? Well, I am saying to the federal government that it would be absolutely phenomenal if we move the money faster to the communities that are being the most impacted first. Those coastal communities, those frontline communities, which include low-income communities, communities of color, and coastal communities. It's making sure that cities have those resources available right away so these changes can start to happen. Climate change isn't waiting for us. The next climate disaster is not saying, oh, let me wait till the money gets in. That's not what is going on. So we need that funding to hit those bank accounts very quickly for cities to be able to disperse the funding, to put jobs in place, and making sure that we are having a solid infrastructure built.
Speaking of the House, so you may have seen that Speaker Nancy Pelosi made an appearance at the COP26 climate summit in Glasgow, Scotland. She called out the role that the Defense Department plays with emissions and then touted the Build Back Better bill. We have a clip of this. Listen to this.
the Defense Department sees this systemically, that we have to stop it as a national security issue, and one way to do that is to stop our dependence on fossil fuels, which exacerbate the climate crisis. Our congressional delegation comes here after advancing legislation to Build Back Better for Women, which represents the most ambitious and consequential climate and clean energy legislation of all time.
She then went on to say that they would pass it by November 15th. If Congress actually moves forward on Build Back Better, what would that mean for the mission against climate change?
Well, I mean, for the first time, we would be seeing environmental justice investments. We would be seeing where there is true change, actually able to start on community levels. This is what it means whenever you're addressing climate change. You have to put the money where your mouth is. We have got to make sure that we are beginning this journey, because it is going to be a journey. Climate change does not have a one-size-fits-all approach. It needs a multitude of solutions that we are going to have to use. It looks different each and every place around the country and around the world. So we need to make sure that we are creating equitable task forces and community leaders, empowering them to make these decisions, that we are bringing young people to the table to help be part of that decision-making process. We need to make sure that we're including all demographics. We're creating those green jobs because, quite frankly, in the next 8 to 10 years, all jobs are going to be climate jobs. This is an approach that is going to take each and every person. And I do believe that Pelosi was spot on with stating that this is monumental legislation, but I will say it is the beginning.
So one of the things that I also heard her say, and I find this tension to be really interesting, is that she starts off saying that this is really a national security issue. And Democrats often do this. They want to talk about why we need to address climate change, but do it in a way that feels palatable, I guess, to Republicans, or trying to, reach the ears of people who don't care about environmental justice in the way that you lay it out. So talk to me about this tension. And do you think that trying to make a connection with national security and environmental justice is actually going to politically help to get people to connect somewhere in the middle?
Well, Aisha, we all know that politics, you have got to cater your conversation to your audience. And so I believe that Speaker Pelosi, that is what she was doing. The DOD refers to climate change as a threat multiplier. That's what the military refers to it as. I do agree with that. It is a different way of saying that it exacerbates every existing stressor. The other thing is that people need to get on board. We're trying to achieve environmental justice, but I believe the same groups of people who have an issue with us connecting the dots between all social justice issues and climate justice being at the center of that are the same ones who have issues with dare I say, the marches last summer and fall, Black Lives Matter. And so I think it's important for us to keep pushing. We can't hold back. I think you very much noted correctly how dependent upon your political affiliation, you adjusting your language or kind of touting down. But us as advocates, it's very important to hold everybody accountable. We can't make sure we're watering down the language. We have got to lay out the facts. We have to make it relatable for our communities.
I really appreciate the way that you talk about the intersectionality of all the consequences of climate change and all the issues that it hits. And this idea of it being a threat multiplier is the way that, Department of Defense talks about it also reminds me, and I know you know a bit about this just from your previous job, it reminds me of migration patterns, too. And the reason that we see the immigration crisis or the migrant crisis, I'll say, is often because you have these climate crises that are happening in poorer countries, and people are fleeing and trying to figure out what are they going to do because there was an earthquake or there was flooding or half the country's burning down because the forests are all on fire or whatever it is, and are trying to figure out where to go for help. And politically, I'm not sure that the United States is even really sensitive to that. So I wonder if, let's just say if, because I talk about this every day on the show, I really want there to be a Build Back Better, act to pass. But let's say that it doesn't, right? That we don't get whatever is being offered up in this particular bill, or it's adjusted. Where do you think we are with what we have right now in terms of the policy platforms that are on the table, or at least the resources that are in place to start to address this coastal flooding issue?
I think in order for us to address the coastal flooding, we have to rely on local elected officials and communities. I think that's really where it's going to actually start to happen, because, as we know, federal government can move slow. That's the unfortunate part to the federal government. And so this is where activism and community activism really helps out. Get involved with your local communities. Google who is an environmental justice group in my community. Go and volunteer with them, making sure that you're making those connections with your local elected officials. Going back to something I said earlier of get on the docket of the city council meeting. These things can happen much faster on the local level than they can on the national level. Not to say that I do not want there to be national legislation and funding to be pouring out. No, that is the dreams and hopes, but we can't stop. So we have to make sure that we are moving at some level to get things done.
Y'all heard it here. Climate equity is, in fact, a social justice issue. Jasmine Sanders, thank you so much for being here tonight and informing us all about climate change and coastal flooding. We would love to have you back at some point. Appreciate your time.